Hard Talk. Douglas Murray, you're Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society. A society and indeed a man, I suppose, who would admire people like George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, former Republican luminaries. This is what they wrote back in 2007. Most alarmingly, the likelihood that non-state terrorists will get their hands on nuclear weaponry is increasing, and non-state terrorist groups with nuclear weapons are conceptually outside the bounds of a deterrent strategy. It's a changing world with new threats, and nuclear deterrence no longer meets them.
Well, I mean, you can come to that conclusion without having to agree with Dr. Kissinger in order to do so. Obviously, the combination of nuclear weaponry and terrorist groups is a nightmare scenario. Of course, they also pose an issue of how on earth you respond to them if you are a nuclear state. Of course they do. But to think that that means that nuclear weaponry is obsolete is ludicrous. Terrorist groups, were they to obtain, for instance, from Pakistan, such weaponry, would obviously be able to be traced, and causes and blame for it would obviously be able to be traced to the people who proliferated and managed to allow such groups to acquire such weapons. But to think in any case that, or to make the category error of thinking that there is only one answer to global security issues is a terrible mistake. There are state actors and there are non-state actors. There are now, particularly, there probably always have been. But the fact is that to think that you only have one tool with which to respond to any security threat is a mistake. Nuclear is a response to a deterrence toward other nuclear states, for instance. But a deterrence against terrorist actors without such weaponry is to have conventional forces, conventional counter-terrorism. It's not an either-or situation.
Kate Hudson, General Secretary of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Let me put you what David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, said recently in defending his commitment to renewing Britain's nuclear deterrent. He said Soviet Union no longer exists, but the nuclear threat has not gone away. The number of nuclear states has not diminished, and there is a real risk of new nuclear-armed states emerging. The threat may have changed, but it's still there.
Yes, he's absolutely right. And I think that's why we have to take major steps to ensure that the threat of nuclear proliferation is diminished and eradicated. The only way we can be certain that we're not going to face nuclear threats in the future is to deal with the problem now and move towards full global multilateral disarmament. Otherwise, we're going to face an increasing number of nuclear weapons states, non-state actors, as Douglas suggests. There will be a widespread or an increasingly widespread access to nuclear weapons, which will end in use either intentionally or accidentally.
Hasn't deterrence kept the peace?
Well, there have been quite a lot of wars since 1945, so one couldn't say whether it's actually stopped any, but it certainly hasn't kept the peace.
Well, I mean, obviously it's kept the peace during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was defeated by by America, Britain, by NATO, without firing a shot. That is how the USSR crumbled. That is how its tyranny over Eastern Europe ended. Now, to think that because you have that standoff, that therefore there will not be any other conflicts is of course nonsense. Of course there are other conflicts. There was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There were many, many other conflicts during that period. But it is a terrible mistake to think that the deterrence of MAD, the deterrence of complete annihilation, is not a deterrence of some kind. Of course it is, and it stops wars between such actors. You could argue we're in such a situation with, for instance, India-Pakistan. India-Pakistan has an extraordinarily volatile relationship. The fact that they are both nuclear states has, to date, although I would not wish that we start from here, has to date managed to stop a full-scale conflagration between those two countries.
Let me put you something on exactly that subject by a former commander of the US Air Force Global Strike Command, Lieutenant General Frank G. Klotz, writing in March of this year. Scholars disagree on the extent to which the very existence of nuclear weapons on the subcontinent may have lowered the prospects for all-out war, yet the ever-present possibility that some future crisis could escalate out of control regardless of what national leaders might actually intend, the consequences could be horrific. That's not a voice from CND, that's a military voice, and he's worried by that. That would suggest that deterrence, whatever it may have done in the past, isn't doing it now.
Well, if there's one thing I suspect that we can, for instance, agree on, it would be this. Nobody is in favour of more proliferation. I think both Kate and I would be, and indeed she mentioned it, in favour of non-proliferation. Nobody wants any more countries to become nuclear. Ideally, the number of countries that are currently nuclear would not be nuclear. But to think that the solution to current global instability, at the very moment that countries like North Korea and Iran are seeking and acquiring nuclear weaponry, is for countries like the UK and the US to dismantle their nuclear weaponry is madness.
Kate, it's a madness to propose it, and there's no blueprint for doing it.
There isn't a blueprint. I think we have to look at this very much in the global context. I was at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference in Geneva, and that reminded me just in what a small minority Britain is in continuing to be a nuclear weapons state. There are around about 180 countries there, the vast majority of which do not have nuclear weapons for their security. Many of them, I think the whole of the Southern Hemisphere is actually organised in various different nuclear weapons-free zones. All these countries believe that nuclear weapons are not necessary to their security, and in fact, to continue with nuclear weapons is a grave disservice to humanity. There's an increasing global dialogue about this, where the majority of states are objecting to the fact that a very small number actually threaten their livelihoods, the continuation of their lives, in fact, and the human race as a whole. And that's the reality of the situation.
Well, Britain doesn't threaten the livelihoods of people around the world because we've got Trident. That's just a silly overstatement.
But I think you should conduct your remarks in a polite fashion.
The fact that we are in a situation where a minority of states have nuclear weapons is, of course, the case.
And they are all obliged under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to undertake steps in good faith towards disarmament. And us agreeing to replace Trident so we are a nuclear-armed state for the next 50-odd years is not a good faith step towards disarmament.
The minority of states in the world today that have nuclear weaponry is a good thing. We want as few countries as possible to have nuclear weaponry.
The less the better.
Absolutely. We're in agreement on that. We're on agreement that we want the fewer is better. However, I do not think it's a wise situation. None would be wonderful. It would be wonderful if this Pandora's box had never opened, but it opened. And the question now for the future is, do we have countries like North Korea, rogue regimes, able to break out very swiftly as they can, as Iran may well be able to in the future? Do we want to live in a world where that happens and other countries like this one, like the US, has no response for that? Or do we want to live in a world where a few countries like this are able to have power?
And
we've
if
established
the North Koreans and the British are both proliferating, we're going to end up with more countries.
You raised that question, but exactly that point I'm very interested by, Kate Hudson, because you said in your remarks earlier that many of the countries don't want nuclear weapons and they don't want their neighbours to have them. The problem is their neighbours do have them. Two surveys are conducted just after the third nuclear test by North Korea, one by Gallup Korea, the other by the Asian Institute for Policy Studies, of South Koreans, that found that 64 to 66.5% between supported South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. New York Times spoke to a Mr. Kwon, an engineer in South Korea, who said having a nuclear North Korea is like facing a person holding a gun with just your bare hands. South Koreans should have our own nuclear capabilities, not least in case the US pulls out as it did over Vietnam. In other words, in the kind of uncertainty we have at the moment, they want to go nuclear, and being members of a non-proliferation treaty makes no difference to them.
Well, they'd have to pull out like North Korea did.
But it's happened.
Well, yeah, North Korea was a member of the NPT, and in the early 2000s, when George Bush said it was on the axis of evil, it left the NPT and said it had a deterrent need to develop nuclear weapons for its own security. Exactly the same argument about security and nuclear weapons possession as we and the other nuclear weapons states perpetuate.
Would you recognise, can I ask, any moral difference there between, for instance, United Kingdom and North Korea?
I think that any country having nuclear weapons is unacceptable. We are obliged under international law.
Do you think there's a difference between North Korea and Great Britain, for instance?
There are many differences, but on the question of nuclear possession, I think it is wrong in both cases.
You think equally wrong or more wrong?
I think equally wrong for any country to have nuclear weapons. And you, I'm sure, are aware of history, and you know that the only country which has ever used nuclear weapons is the United States, and it used them against a country that did not have a so-called nuclear deterrent.
In order to finish and close World War II, yes.
Yeah, and we already know from the testimony of many senior politicians and military people that Japan was already attempting
that's the ND's version of history.
No, you keep on saying this. But you should hear what people like Winston Churchill had to say about
it. It's the CND's version of history.
Just on this question
it's a jolly good one because it's an accurate one.
I'm afraid that's not Winston Churchill. It wasn't Winston Churchill's view. It's CND's.
Let's not argue about the past too much. I'm quite keen to talk about the present and the future.
Good idea.
And just on the present, Douglas Murray, we talked a bit about North Korea and why North Korea might be motivated. Is there a danger that actually the system we have at the moment, rather than deterring, is actually perversely encouraging proliferation? And I give the example of North Korea because you wrote an article about 3 years ago in which you specifically said there's this desire among rogue states and states that want to prove themselves on the international stage to join the big boys club, as you put it. North Korea, by aping the nuclear powers, its leaders believe they can bypass all those tedious interim stages of getting a functioning economy or food and water for citizens and go straight to the top table by virtue of its nuclear arsenal. This temptation will exist as long as nuclear weaponry exists. I mean, in a sense, it becomes a self-perpetuating thing.
Right.
Isn't that in itself a case for getting rid of them?
No, it's a case for making sure that countries like North Korea never have nuclear weaponry. It is a case for saying that
so where would that take you?
It would mean that you did everything you could to stop countries like Iran, North Korea becoming nuclear countries.
So who else would you accept as a nuclear country?
I wouldn't want any other country to become a nuclear country.
So it's a closed club.
It's a closed club.
But just on those,
should be.
But just on those two countries, we don't know what Iran's state of Iran's nuclear ambitions are.
Well,
they say they're only interested in nuclear energy. Other countries say they want to acquire a weapon. But are you saying if we get to that stage, and we are at that stage with, it is alleged, although the accuracy is questioned, of North Korea's weapons programme, there is a moral obligation on other states to eliminate those weapons?
Yes, there's a moral and a strategic obligation
so bomb
to do
them.
so. Do anything you can. Do everything and anything you can to stop countries like Iran joining the nuclear club.
Including bombing those
including
sites.
bombing. There's a very interesting lesson to be learned from North Korea. Why is, I mean, I don't agree with the version of history of the last 10 years that was just given about North Korea, but why, for instance, if you were the regime in Pyongyang, why would you not seek to acquire them at the moment? You saw, and I think this is an important point to make, you saw Colonel Gaddafi, for instance, volunteer up his nuclear program to President Bush and Prime Minister Blair after the invasion of Iraq. You saw Gaddafi do that.
So you can't get back into Pandora's box.
But subsequently,
South Africa gave them up as well.
There are some cases of nascent nuclear programs, such as Libya. This is more advanced than some people thought, but certainly nowhere near. Could I just finish my point? It was much further advanced than most people thought. Gaddafi subsequently gave them up. But some years later, when he then started brutalizing his people again and so on, there was an international intervention, and I think a correct one. However, if you were the regime in Pyongyang, you would probably notice that NATO was able to go and intervene in Gaddafi's Libya when it was not nuclear, but very, very much fears intervening in countries where they are nuclear. So I think, yes, the international community gives off a very bad signal. It gives off the signal that if you are able to nuke up fast, you could remain in power forever.
That's right. It's the same argument that we have. We need them for our national security, and we're not prepared to give them up. I think what I'd be interested in hearing from Douglas about is, given that we are, as a country, signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, our own government and former governments are very committed to that multilateral disarmament goal, to Article 6 of the NPT about progress towards disarmament. How would you propose that we do take steps towards nuclear disarmament?
I don't propose, well, I suggest that we take steps to minimise the number of nuclear warheads worldwide, which we're committed to. But, I mean, to think that that leads to the complete annihilation of our nuclear capability is nonsensical.
Well, that's in the treaty, we're signed up to that.
We should not, at any stage, be thinking of disarming ourselves, of America disarming itself of nuclear weaponry, when we have seen in recent months, we'll see in the months ahead, that rogue regimes are able to acquire these weapons. It is madness to do so.
You're in a very small minority, in your opinion.
You're in a very small minority, in your opinion. That's why CND can't find the funding it wants.
You obviously haven't read opinion polls over the last several years, which show the majority of the population is in favour of scrapping Trident and cancelling the replacement. Globally, obviously, it's massively in favour of nuclear disarmament.
First of all, I don't think
you're on a losing ticket now. You may have been in the majority
I doubt I am on a losing
decades ago,
ticket. CND's
but you're
been
in
on
a
a losing
minority
ticket for decades.
We may have been in a minority
Can't
in the
hear
past,
it when you're both speaking at once. Just finish your point.
But now we're in the majority, and that's shown by opinion polls in Britain and around the world.
The campaign for nuclear disarmament has lost. It's lost for decades. Of course it has. Its argument hasn't been listened to, and nor should it be.
But aren't things changing?
But they're changing.
The debate changing because the threats are changing.
Of course, the debate's always changing, and so it should. And it doesn't matter, by the way, whether I'm in a minority or not. I don't particularly care whether it's a minority opinion or not. It's whether or not it's the case or not. So, can I just finish my case?
No,
can I just finish my point?
We're allowed to talk over
I know you keep talking over me, and your points aren't.
I think you're both doing very well at it.
My points aren't worth
the intervention in most cases. But the point that's worth reiterating on this is that, of course, as I say, we're all for non-proliferation. I don't think any of us want more nuclear weaponry in the world.
I would like to see,
if I can just finish, I would like to see Britain able to retain a nuclear deterrent. I would like to see the United States retain a nuclear deterrent. I do wish that Pakistan and India, for instance, did not have a nuclear deterrent, but we are where we are. Whatever position you come from, however, it is madness to think that we and Pyongyang, for instance, are on a moral equilibrium.
Well, just because we sort of touched on that already, but just on that very specific point about we are where we are, do we have to be, Kate Hudson, where we are? Are there incentives, are there mechanisms, given that non-proliferation treaty, for all its virtues as you see them, hasn't stopped countries since the treaty was established in 1970 acquiring nuclear weapons, acquiring nuclear status, whether by leaving the NPT or never joining it in the first place? Are there incentives that could actually persuade some countries to leave? Is there a mechanism that would help people to say we want to relinquish our nuclear weapons?
Well, we have seen a number of countries actually give up nuclear arsenals. South Africa, for example, had an arsenal which it gave up after the apartheid regime. We saw a number of successor states from the Soviet Union also give up their nuclear weapons. Many countries around the world with sort of borderline capacity, with a technological capacity, chose not to do that. And I think that in terms of moving forward globally, there's a very strong recognition that something else would be better. In terms of Britain, what would be better, if you're looking at how we spend our money on defence, for example, the opportunity cost in defence terms of maintaining Trident is absolutely massive. And there was an op-ed in the New York Times last week where a senior US official was quoted as saying Britain can either have Trident, this was in terms of NATO and some military capacity, Britain can either have Trident, it can be a nuclear weapons state, or it can be a useful military partner. In other words, if we have Trident, we're a nuclear weapons state, but if we don't have Trident, we can actually have a whole range of other kit. We can restore some of the troops that we've already lost because of the defence cuts. We can have all kinds of other useful things, which is one of the reasons why a number of senior military figures say we should scrap Trident, that it's militarily useless, and we should actually spend it on useful defence capacity. And in this government's own national security strategy a couple of years ago, they actually downgraded the threat of state-on-state nuclear warfare to a Tier 2 threat. Level 1 threats, things like cyber warfare, terrorism, pandemics, climate change, real things we need to address.
Just on that question then, Douglas Murray, I mean, do you find it perverse that the British government wants to spend, what, 25 billion on renewing a weapon it has no intention of using, it would regard as a failure of diplomatic and military strategy if it ever had to use it, but at the same time can't find the money for an army that's any bigger than it was when Napoleon was the biggest threat that Britain faced?
No, I mean, this is like talking about the NHS in terms of, you know, should the NHS cure cancer or should we have hospitals? Should the NHS tackle diabetes or should we deal with another disease? You deal with the problems you have in front of you.
But is this the right way of dealing with them? That's the point.
You can, just as surely as you can make sure that funding for other parts of the state is suitable.
But we've already
had big cuts in the troops, Yes, and I think that was very unwise.
Yeah. But the money isn't there for all the big projects. If I could just finish
another point. Personally, I think it's perfectly obvious that you can have a nuclear deterrent and you can also have conventional forces. In the world we live in today, we need both a nuclear deterrent for nuclear-armed states and to deter them, and we also need conventional forces. Of course,
that's wishful thinking, Douglas. The money isn't
come on,
there.
you've been doing decades of wishful thinking. You can't criticise me for it now.
The money's not there, is it?
Look, the money is the money.
Exactly, honestly.
Look, sorry, that was an opening. Come on. Look, it's not an either-or.
Now,
it's not an either-or.
He should be a gentleman.
It's not an either-or decision. Of course, people in the senior members of the military are always going to be aggravated, and they are aggravated, when they see this amount of money on Trident, and they see their own troops being cut, when they see terrible pay for the armed forces, when they see people being sent off to Afghanistan on very, very low pay. Of course, military leaders are aggravated by that. But to think that you aren't going to need all of these tools in the toolbox to respond to the problems of the 21st century is ludicrous.
Where would you cut the money from to pay for all of that?
Oh, all sorts of places.
Let's look ahead then. 20 years from now, what will the state of the world's nuclear arsenal look like? What, if anything, will be different as a result of the debate that's taking place internationally now?
By what date did you say?
20 years
20
ahead.
years time. I would like to think, well, an optimistic forecast would be that we would be in the final stages of full global eradication. I think what is possible, if not very possible, is that we'll see increased bilateral reductions between the United States and Russia, which they're both committed to. When they get down to a certain level, I think it's also very possible, and this has been mooted into international circles, that the other nuclear weapon states will then come to the table and talk about reducing together. I think that's very, very possible. I think in terms of putative nuclear weapon states and states with nuclear ambitions, I think that at that point they can also be drawn into the discussion.
I would like to see a situation in which countries like the US, USSR, scaled down the number of warheads they had.
Russia, don't live in the past.
I would like to see a situation in which this country retained its nuclear deterrent. I would like to see a situation where nobody else joined the nuclear club, where Iran was not a nuclear power, where Pyongyang was not a nuclear power. I'd like to see a situation where no more countries break out. However, 20 years from now, if those who believe that the onus is entirely on us have their way, then we'll live in a world in which the worst regimes have the worst weapons and the best regimes have none.
An intriguing final question to you, Kate. Nuclear weapons are a terrible thing. From your point of view, they are an unacceptable thing.
Yeah.
Does that mean there is a moral obligation to eliminate them and, if necessary, prevent countries getting them? Going so far as actually bombing weapons sites?
I don't believe that bombing is the way to resolve what are very often the result of complex regional problems. We've talked about proliferation.
Is prevention better than treating the after effects?
I think that we have to prevent nuclear proliferation through the peaceful dialogue process. I think that we have to also be aware that steps that we take ourselves will have consequences. And if we decide to replace Trident now, we will be contributing to global proliferation.
I can assure you Pyongyang is not looking to London for moral lessons. They're not looking to London for moral lessons.
And that is the last word on nuclear deterrence on Hudson.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.